I mean, I think it could come down that we cleaned it up.
Can you look up to see if we're on?
I mean, we just had to figure out,
Please.
I mean, and if it's not, but the fact that we just get it down, we just.
All right, everyone.
Set it up.
Yeah.
And but
We're gonna get started.
See, I'm gonna put out the start. The first time I did
Welcome to Empowering Pastors Leadership Training. This is hosted by Dr. Michael Spencer, who clearly is not here. He is actually down in Florida right now at a John Maxwell training. As Pastor says, we are hypocrites if we teach about leadership development, but we ourselves are not growing. And if you are a mentor and you don't have one, you're a hypocrite. If you are a leader but you don't have one, you're a hypocrite. So it's awesome that we sit under a man of God that is not a hypocrite. He is actually being trained up right now. So that's absolutely great. Before we get into our teaching today, we want to just remind you about the Empower Summit coming up. It's on March 19th through the 21st. We're going to have Pastor Larry Stockstill from Bethany Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We're going to have Bishop Rick Thomas from Abundant Life in Margate, Florida. We're going to have our very own Dr. Michael Spencer. It's going to be a phenomenal time. You can just hop on empoweringpastors.com for you to get signed up. You'll also be just receiving a slew of emails that has all the information that you want to make sure you can be looking at that. There also is a time period that we will go from regular rates to our late registration. So you want to make sure that you're going to get registered right now. So again, that's www.empoweringpastors.com. All right. Dr. Spencer also wanted me to ask if anybody has not done their homework. For them to make sure that you submit, you are excused for this week, but make sure that you submit your payment of $25 either to me, now I have a collector's fee, or you can do it via PayPal to pastorspencer@gmail.com. All right, and without any further ado, we're going to have Pastor Dean. He's going to continue with his training from the past few weeks ago. It was absolutely great. So we're going to be going into something that we have already touched on. He's going to be going at it from a different angle. So let's give it up for Pastor Dean.
Thank you, and it's an honor and privilege to be here. There was a fellow who was hired as a new manager to a factory that was underperforming. And when he arrived, he wanted to establish his authority, his leadership rather quickly. And so he went down and observed in the workplaces this individual who was standing there leaning up against the wall. And to show everyone that he meant business, he walked up to this guy and said, "Look, here's $100. It's your last day. Get out of here." And the guy just kind of looked at him and took the $100 and said, "Okay," walked out. And then he turned to the rest of the people in the room and he said, "So who was this guy and what did he do?" And it was just, "Oh, that's Jeff, the pizza delivery guy." And so while his intentions were to put himself forward, he really didn't have any idea what he was doing. Last time I was here, I spoke on a book called Crucial Conversations. And Crucial Conversations deal with high stakes interactions when emotions run strong and opinions vary. Now, a subset of Crucial Conversations is crucial accountability. These are conversations that focus on issues related to accountability. And this is when different parties have an understanding and an agreement, and they have assignments. And at some point, someone along the way has failed to complete his or her assignment. It's based on this book. I'll just hold it up, Crucial Conversation or Crucial Accountability. And I'm going to kind of offer a summary synopsis of the material in this book. I think that in addition to that, Crucial Conversations, Crucial Accountability deals with those kinds of issues, those prickly, complicated, and often frightening, sometimes performance discussions, sometimes expectation discussions that often are very difficult, for which most of us have zero training. And we have to kind of figure it out ourselves. Even in a work environment where they do these things regularly, they're usually held privately. So we don't see how other people hold these kind of accountability discussions with other people. We only experience it when they're held with us. which may or may not be a good and positive experience. So I'd like to explore some of the issues related to these things, because not only does it affect workplaces, it affects families and homes. Accountability isn't just simply managing someone that reports to you. Accountability has to do with teams that work together, has to do with an employee who holds his or her employer accountable to proper standards. Most of the standards that we deal with, both in our families and in the workplace, aren't written down. And we have some basic work guidelines that might be, have an employee handbook and that sort of thing. Families generally don't write these things down. When you do, it's typically come to a point where they need to be written down. It's sort of like when I'm dealing with my son and I say, okay, the expectation is chore day is Saturday mornings. Chores will be done on Saturday morning. And so after a certain amount of times that by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, chores aren't completed, then we have to have more conversations. And sometimes you do something like write it down. But usually when it's come to that point in a family, things haven't been healthy for quite a while. Now, when it comes to these kind of conversations, the reality is that most of us avoid them. This group that put together this book did a study where they had people cut in line in front of other people. And what they found was that virtually no one ever confronts somebody who cuts in line. Now, they might grimace, they might make faces, they might turn to the person next to them and say something loud enough for the person to hear, oh, I guess that person didn't know where the end of the line was. But they won't necessarily have a direct conversation with that person or actually confront them. They found this was true. Now, cutting in line is kind of a simple and fairly benign situation where you might kind of talk to somebody about it, but they upped the ante. They went into libraries and sat next to people and then started making a whole bunch of noises and found that nobody would tell them to be quiet. They upped it even further. They went into cafeterias and colleges and sat next to people and literally take food off the other person's tray and found that almost no one would say anything. Even in situations where they would go on and make racist statements, make obnoxious statements, suggest that they might be plotting to abduct somebody, almost no one would confront what was going on. Because there's kind of this fear to talk about these things. Or sometimes the situations get volatile. In workplaces, sometimes the most intense conversations revolve around politics. You know, kind of in a church setting, I've even found that in my own situation where when our staff meetings touch on political issues, because we've got people on separate sides of the aisle, things can get pretty heated pretty fast. And unfortunately, sometimes they get unkind. And you would think that, you know, if there was a place where people should be able to comfortably talk about politics, it would be among fellow Christians, even if you disagree. But emotions get high. Now, in some situations, when we try to take the other end of the spectrum and we become abrasive, we can cause violations which amount to repercussions. In the book, they have this saying called the law of the hog. And they talk about a situation where in a factory, this supervisor literally punched out an employee because he was frustrated with his performance and the guy was just defiant. And so they ran a kind of an exploration in terms of trying to find out how things worked and how things people resolve conflict in the workplace. And one of the employees, when they talked about when the manager puts expectations out there that are unrealistic, what happens? And someone in the crowd said, well, we feed the hog. I said, what's this feeding the hog? And they said, well, it was a lumber factory and they milled wood and this sort of thing. They said, well, what happens is that when we have imperfect pieces of wood that we can't sell, we throw it into this shredder that turns it into sawdust and we use it to heat the building. And so when we get upset with the managers, what we do is we start to throw perfectly good pieces of wood into the hog that get shredded up, and it causes our production levels to drop. It's the way we get back at our employers. And so what happens is if we swing to the other side, we don't manage people well and we just make them angry, they find ways to get back at us, whether we know it or not. And so when we look at the situation, most people fear accountability and confrontation. And so when unrealistic expectations are put upon them in the workplace, they don't say anything about it. When people underperform, they try to deal with it in sort of indirect or passive aggressive ways. Often we feel that we're faced with just two choices, two bad choices, either to stay silent, or we think by speaking up, we'll create new problems. And so those are two options which aren't the only choices that we have, but often that's where we feel we are. We either have a choice that's not saying anything, or if we do, we'll just create more problems. And that isn't just in the workplace, but that can be even at home. So what we need to do is to learn from what are called positive deviants. These are people who, through the research that this organization has done, have identified as highly successful individuals who carry out crucial accountability successfully. And so they're deviants. They're not the norm. They're in this minor 5 to 10%, but they outperform the other 90 to 95% to a massive degree. And they operate often counterintuitively, and they don't respond to situations just instinctually. Take, for example, a coworker commits an infraction and then is confronted, and the response is kind of defiant, and they say, so what's the big deal? Now, a regular, ordinary person will typically start to lecture this person and tell them what's going wrong, whereas a positive deviant will take a different approach. Or you might have a coworker who suggests that they're facing a barrier. I tried to do it, I couldn't figure it out, I couldn't figure out how to use the tracking software. Okay, well, the average person might kind of cut in and say, okay, I'm going to show you how to use it. Where a positive deviant, someone who really knows how to manage people, won't simply go in and take over. They'll help that person be able to find a way to learn and discover themselves. And so there are different ways of approaching things that are counterintuitive in many ways. But when we look at it, we begin to discover, well, this starts to make sense because it resonates with our own experience. So we often find ourselves with three choices. One is we choose silence. Silence often because it's comfortable. Now, in that whole line illustration where they had people cutting in line, they found another approach where they had somebody already in line who was sort of staged, and then they had another staged person cut in front of them. And then the first person who was already in line took the approach of saying, hey, you, don't you know where the end of the line is? Get back, we've been waiting here, in a kind of an angry tone. What they found then is that moments later, they would have another person come along and cut in line behind the person who just sort of bullied the person to the back of the line. And they found it didn't make any difference. The people still didn't speak up and address the person who cut in the line because they didn't want to be a bully either. They chose silence because they didn't know what to say. They chose not to bully, even though bullying was demonstrated to them. Then they tried a third approach. And the third approach was when someone cut in front of them, they took a different respectful tone. They said to the person, well, I'm sorry, but don't you realize that the back of the line is, we've been waiting here for 30 minutes and the line runs all the way back there. And then that person would go to the back of the line. And then moments later, they would have yet another person cut in front, again, behind the person who was staged. And what they would find is the person behind them would model almost word for word what they saw because they saw a positive interaction in terms of how to handle something which was unacceptable behavior. And so when we see it done, when we can imagine it being done, we can start to do it, but it takes some control. So what we need to do is we need to have a respectful response, and we do that by starting to work on me first, precisely because we can only change ourselves. We really can't change other people. Now, when we ask others to account for their actions, it lives and dies on the words people choose and the way people deliver them. So it's what we say and how we say it that makes all the difference in the world. Because we're emotional beings. And when we feel like we're under attack or threatened, what happens is our adrenaline rises. When our adrenaline rises, the blood supplying the brain moves to the muscles. And so the brain becomes reptilian. And so we move into a whole different type of mindset, and we operate out of emotions as opposed to fully engaged, thoughtful human beings. So the approach is that we need to put our thoughts in order before we put our mouths in gear. And so we have to decide and choose what and if we're going to have one of these crucial accountability sessions. And so choosing the what. Okay, what is it? Because life is complicated and most situations are multi-layered. Take, for example, say you were eating dinner with your family at home, and all of a sudden your in-laws show up and just simply walk into the house. Okay, on the surface, that might not be a big deal, but let's just say that this is something that's happened before and that you've already talked to them about arriving unannounced, and especially that maybe doing it during dinner time is not a particularly helpful thing to do. And so you ask yourself, well, what is it that you're going to talk about? What are you going to say? All right, you could say, well, we don't have enough food. We didn't plan on you being here. We've already started eating. That would be kind of, on the surface, a simple thing to talk about. But on a deeper level, there's a whole question of breaking an agreement. You know, we had an agreement here. And to enter into that conversation is a far more difficult thing, especially as they sit over there sulking in the corner because they're not joining you at the dinner table. And they refuse their invitations because they realize that you've already started, you haven't prepared, but the emotions begin to run high. Take for another example, a family situation where, say, the husband's been gone for a couple of weeks, he comes home, she's had to take care of the kids, she's kind of tired and been working very hard and is behind in the things that she wants to do. He's looking forward to some cuddle time on the couch that might lead to whatever. And so he invites her to come join her on the couch. And she is kind of busy and ignores the first request. And then maybe a second time asks her to join and says, I'd like some time on the couch here. And she's still too busy running around taking care of the kitchen. And finally, he gets pretty frustrated. And so he asks the question, so what is keeping the ice queen so busy? With sort of a sarcasm in his voice. And then he's totally befuddled why that just simply doesn't change her mood. You know, so the ways in which we enter into these things can have really undesirable consequences because we start to not move in the rational, but the irrational and the emotional. And so we find that problems come in complicated bundles. Take another example. You have a daughter who promises to come home from her first big date by midnight. She shows up at 1. Midnight, it's kind of late. But say she shows up at 1 a.m. Okay, now we've got a problem. So what is the issue here? Okay, is it that she's late? Well, yes, it is. But is there something bigger going on? Does the conversation need to focus on a broken promise? Or the fact that she violated her father's trust? Or maybe that she drove her father crazy and insane because he was fearing that she might be in a car accident or something terrible happened to her? Or maybe she did it purposefully and willfully to disobey a family rule. Or maybe she openly defied her father in an effort to break free from parental control. Or maybe she was getting even with her father for grounding her the previous weekend. Or maybe she knew that she would drive her father bonkers if she was to go out with a guy who sported 12 face piercings. You never know. So there's a whole bunch of different layers of which this one particular event triggers in terms of how is it to be dealt with. And so one of the questions is, how do we know, how do we become aware that we're dealing with the wrong problem in a situation? What are the signs that you're dealing, what are the signs you're dealing with the wrong problem and your solutions don't get you what you really want? One of it is you're constantly discussing the same issue. You keep coming back to the same problem over and over again. It doesn't see, there's no progress. Or you find that you're increasingly getting upset about this. One of the ways in which this can be manifested is that you start talking about the problems that is occurring with the person with whom the problem is occurring. So you start talking about problems at work when you get home. You talk about your employer, you talk about colleagues, you talk about subordinates, or you talk about your spouse or your children to other people. It's a good sign that you're not successfully dealing with the issue. So what's key is that you confront the right issue. So it means that you need to first take time to unbundle the problem. So immediately responding to a situation isn't always the best, especially if we find that we're running high on the emotional level. So because it means stepping back and saying, okay, well, what really are the issues here, and decide what's bothering you the most. And then once you've decided what that is, being able to concisely articulate it in a single sentence. Because if you can't articulate it in a single sentence, you probably aren't sure what it is that's getting to you, what really is bothering you. So one of the helpful tools to getting to the right conversation is to think CPR. So first, content. What actually happened? She was late. She didn't come home when she was supposed to come home. That's the content. Okay. Now, content's important, and usually this is the easiest thing to deal with. So what then is the next thing is pattern. Usually when it's a one-off event, it's usually not a big deal unless the situation is a serious one. But most of the things we deal with aren't in and of themselves. It's when they become a pattern. And then it means shifting to talking about, well, it's really not about this event. It's about that it's the 10th time this event has occurred. We just listened to my wife having a conversation with our daughter this morning, and the temptation is
Little
for
daughter.
I'm sorry, not this daughter. I should clarify. My
My
8-year-old about an issue of getting herself ready in the morning. Okay, and so what I observed was a classic pattern that when you try to address the pattern, the person pulls away from the pattern and wants to go back to the content. She just kept saying, well, I just didn't do it this morning. Well, no, it isn't about the fact that you didn't do it this morning. It's about the fact that you haven't done it this morning and last morning and the last 3-4 weeks or whatever. It's this repeated pattern. And that moves into the third level, or the third concern is relationship. So content's one thing, pattern brings it to a deeper level. But then addressing the issue of how does this pattern affect the relationship between the two of you? Or for that matter, it might be for other people around you. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's this process of unbundling and then prioritizing what's really important. And so you need to ask yourself, well, what do you want and what you don't want in this situation? And all of this takes time and intentionality. So in the prioritization process, you're asking, what is it that I want for myself, for yourself, and what you don't want for yourself? And so for the other person, what do you want for the other person and what you don't want for the other person? And then what do you want for the relationship and what you don't want for the relationship? So take, for example, the husband and wife thing. So the husband clearly wants some affection. He wants some intimacy, okay? So what he doesn't want is he doesn't want tension between them, because this isn't going to get him what he wants. And then she probably doesn't want tension either. So, but she wants some patience and respect, or maybe she wants time, and maybe she doesn't want intimacy. Depends on what's going on. But it requires then for him to discover what's going on with her before he just thinks about his own expectations. And so he needs to think through all those scenarios before he decides, well, what is he going to do? So take another example. You have some preteen kids. They're been invited to go out to a drive-in movie by the neighbors. You've given them permission to stay up late. You've popped them some popcorn. They're so excited they can't see straight. And then all of a sudden, the next door neighbors pull up in a pickup truck with the two of their kids in the back of the pickup truck. And then your kids join them. And all of a sudden, one of you realizes, okay, well, this isn't particularly safe, right? You have a high standard of safety when you go drive. You insist that the seat belts are fastened. And now they're sitting in the back of the truck peeling with laughter and joy that they're going to go for this fun ride. Well, then you begin to raise the question about safety to your neighbors, who respond by saying, don't be a fuss budget, don't be a wart. And you're about to talk about the fact that you're concerned about their safety, and your spouse cuts in and says to the driver, the father, so you're going to be really safe, right? When you drive, you're going to be really careful. We got some precious cargo back there. And he says, yeah, don't worry about it. And he says, okay, we'll see you later. And the truck pulls away with a squeal. What's gone on there? There's a whole bunch of different things that have gone on there. One, there's been this violation of the question of safety. Okay, that's an easy thing to talk about. But that boat has sailed or sort of rumbled down the road. That's already passed. There's no really addressing that. But then there's another thing that you don't want to be interrupted or cut off or dismissed by your spouse, especially in a public situation. And you'll also want to be able to talk about the issue without feeling attacked by the other person or attacking the other person. You also want to know that you're unified around safety things that you've established, or agreements that you have in the family, that you're not going to be one against the other. And then maybe the deeper thing is that you want to stop a pattern, if this has been a pattern, of your spouse taking away your vote by making a public and unilateral announcement without ensuring that you're in agreement. In front of the neighbors, you don't have much to discuss it, so it needs to be discussed and worked out beforehand. And so what's critical in being able to hold these conversations effectively is really understanding, well, what is it that you want to come out of this situation? What's really the most important thing? So then is choosing the question if. There's the what conversations to have and if I want to have them. Now, there is a difference between the trivial and the consequential. And so when, for example, it's clearly a broken promise, that would be consequential. But sometimes it can be unclear and iffy. And not speaking when you should or speaking when you shouldn't can cause various problems. Most of us tend to err towards going towards the silent. We don't confront, we don't speak up. Some of us speak up about too much. We point out too many infractions. We get caught in the minutiae. We get little things that bother us. But so to ask the question, to begin to decide, okay, do I need to address this issue? If I should go forward. So one question might be, is that, am I acting out my concern? In other words, am I becoming passive aggressive? Or am I beginning to find that as I stuff this stuff down to my toes, it comes oozing out of my face. It comes out in the way that I treat people or indirectly. So take, for example, a situation where a 29-year-old is still living at home. He's eating dinner and he points out to his mother that she has a hunk of lasagna hanging from her chin in a polite way. And she retorts, well, when I was 29 years old at your age, I had 2 jobs. Okay. there's a whole different layer of emotion going on, so that one thing pulls out another. And that's a sign this is a conversation that's been missed and needs to be had. Sometimes we can find that our conscience nags at us. And so I ask the question, is my conscience nagging at me? Digging at me? Sometimes we don't do things because of peer pressure or because of fear, lots of different reasons. But deep down, sometimes if we're just really thinking about it, we're going to continue to sense that something is wrong here and I need to address it. So am I choosing the certainty of silence over the risk of speaking up? So we ask the question, sometimes we ask the question, can I succeed? And if I feel that I'm really uncertain as whether I can succeed in this conversation, I won't even try. But the first question is, really, should I try? Should I enter into this conversation? Because if I start with this can I succeed question, I'm more than likely going to talk myself out of trying. And so if I understand, okay, well, I should try this, and then I need to explore, well, how can I make sure I succeed? One of the things that we do is that we're downplaying the cost of not speaking up. So we minimize the consequences. And so, for example, we ignore the big picture. If I don't address this issue with this employee or with this family member, I don't see the big picture. So if I have an older child who's misbehaving, setting a bad example to the rest of my child, and I don't speak up, I may downplay that consequence that, okay, the younger kids are going to look at the older kids and learn bad behavior. And so I need to address it, not just for his sake or for my sake, but for the bigger picture that's going on. Or we can sometimes become accustomed to abuse. The way people speak to us, we kind of get used to it. We get used to being disrespected. We get used to being even abused. We can get used to that too. And so we just put up with it. We don't demand to be treated respectfully. And then also we don't necessarily recognize that it's how it's affecting us, how it's causing us to act badly. Then the flip side of it is that we can exaggerate the costs of speaking up. So what can happen is that we can conjure up scenarios that aren't probable. They may be possible, but then we move them into the probable category and we talk ourselves out of speaking up. We think, well, this is probably going to happen. And if we focus just on that, we really don't open ourselves up to the real possibilities that can happen. Sometimes because we fear the personality of the person that we're dealing with, because they're inclined to get angry or they get short with us. Part of that is being able to move beyond those fears and engaging and learning the tools to be able to engage in these conversations that even work with some of the most difficult people. The people who did the research on this book observed that in many situations, there were employers that the employees felt were unapproachable about problems. That if they did, they would just get swatted down or demeaned or whatever. But they found that there was these certain positive deviants that were able to speak with them and relate to them. And it was that they studied. Well, how were they able to do that? And that even with difficult people, the right approach can turn things around. Sometimes I can find myself that I'm telling myself that I'm helpless. We fail not because it's the bad or wrong thing to do. It's because we don't handle it well. We handle the situation poorly. And so we decide to not to step up to a failed promise or an arrangement because we just don't know how to do it well. The good news, though, is that we can learn the skills. If we handle it badly, very quickly we're going to be headed into a battle. And so the challenge is to learn how to handle things right from the beginning in order to avoid the emotional response that brings us into a battle. And then there's always the times when we shouldn't speak up, and usually it's the minor things or the one-off occasions that aren't of great significance. And so that's when we have to weigh things out. So in terms of dealing with myself, one of the first things is, in a sense, what they call being master of my stories. How to get your head right before you open your mouth. And so there is this saying they used to say in conversations that there's this sort of hazardous 30 seconds. The first 30 seconds in a conversation sets the tone, but it's actually shorter than 30 seconds. It's 0 seconds. What happens in the 30 seconds is determined by what happens in my head before the 30 seconds occurs. So how I'm thinking about what's going to happen and what I'm going to say happens in my head before the tone is set in those first 30 seconds. And so there's this little diagram I have on your sheets there that is typically our path to action, where it takes us. We see and we hear an event that takes place. We observe it. Then we typically tell a story about it. In other words, we decide what the motivations are here, the intentions. Why did all of this happen? Okay. Now, the challenge is that sometimes we can get pretty nasty in the stories that we tell. We can come up with all sorts of negative motives as to why this person did what they did. That generates within us certain feelings and emotions. And the result is that we then act on it. And so when we jump to those conclusions and make those assumptions, typically what's going to happen is we're going to drive the other person either into silence or violence, or we become violent. Now, I don't mean necessarily physically, that's the worst case scenario, but most of the time it's violence through the way we speak, the words that we use, the way we relate to the person, because the emotions run high. But if we can stop and become masters of our stories, we also can become masters of our emotions. That we begin to get control of how we're feeling about the situation, because we realize that we don't have all the information. We may be confident that we do. We may be confident that we understand the person better than they understand themselves. And we come up with a story that explains the behavior. But that almost never works. People don't want to be told why they've done something wrong. They don't want to be told that their motivations are poor. They even might be. But if you point out to them, you're not going to just say, oh, now that you mention it, yes, I really do hate your guts, and I just did this to hurt you. Or, yes, I am a deeply selfish person now that you mention it, and I need to just change my entire life. People just don't respond that way. And it's getting them to try to figure out what you're concerned about by telling them their psychological makeup, and it's entirely ineffective. And so the better approach is begin to look at what I have down here. I didn't make this up. This is their stuff. Is the 6 sources of influence. And what it means is that instead of coming to conclusions and articulate those conclusions for the other person, allow them to tell their story and understand that why somebody does something could come from all sorts of different places. And so there's either motivation or ability. People do things because they're either motivated or not motivated to do them, or they do them because they are able to or not able to. And the influences around that come from 3 different areas, which give us, in a sense, 6 sources of influence. And so in the first one, the person has to want to do whatever it is that you want them to do. And then secondly, they need to be able to or can do what it is that you want them to do. So motivation on a personal level is want to, ability is can do. If they can't do it, for example, then the solution for the manager or the person is to either enable them to be able to do it, get them the skills to do it. You want me to write a report that's 15 pages long. I don't have a computer or access to a printer, or I don't know how to type, or I don't, those are sort of obvious ways in which someone might not be able to do something. There may be a social factor. For example, peer pressure under 3. Nobody is supporting the thing that I'm being called to do, or people are pressuring me to cut corners, or I have friends who don't do what I do, and I feel an oddball by having to do them. So I get peer pressure. So I don't want to do what you want to do. Or my friends model poor behavior to their parents, and so I learn to treat my parents the same way. Social inability, number 4, is help from others. Sometimes we can't do things alone and we need help from others. That might be in a larger situation where in order for me to be able to execute on one thing, I need someone to provide me information. So I can't go ahead and create the wall that needs to be made unless the person who buys the supplies gets them to me on time in order for me to make the wall. So sometimes there's the social interactions. People need help from other people in order to be able to do what they need to do. Structural is simpler. More simply, on number 5 is the carrot and the stick. So people have structural incentives. They get paid more, they get bonuses, or they get rewarded, or they get compliments, or they get affirmation, or they get punishments, or they lose things and lose privileges. Those are things that would motivate somebody. And then the structures sometimes can be subtle. It's structural ability as structures, environments, and tools. And so, for example, modern technology changes the way in which people relate to each other. When the microwave arrived, it allowed, for example, family members to more easily prepare their meals. But for some families, it also allowed members to individually prepare their meals more easily. And so what some families experienced was that family time for mealtime broke down because, you can just pop something in the microwave and eat it yourself. It's real simple. It doesn't require as much preparation and presentation, so family mealtime breaks down. What we now see is cell phones are a wonderful tool, right? Just walk down the street and you just see people looking at their cell phones, not necessarily engaged. People can isolate into their bedrooms and they have a connection to the world and they lose connection with their family. And so all these tools, these structural things affect how people relate to each other and how systems work. And sometimes people need tools, and sometimes certain things that are introduced into an organization or a system, such as a family, can adversely affect how that system functions. So the next thing is that we need to describe the gap. When we engage into the conversation, being able to explain, well, here is what my understanding was of the arrangement. You're going to be home at midnight, and you got home at 1 a.m. That's the gap. Okay. So we can explain the gap. That's the easy part. But when you add to it the story, you did this because you're a careless, inconsiderate child, changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. Okay. And so to leave that part out, to take out our ugly story and describe the gap, and then allow the person to respond. So know what not to do. First, we don't play games. There's this, you probably have heard the way, how do you call someone to account, give them a compliment, then call them out on the issue, and then give them another compliment. It's called the sandwich. It's compliment, criticism, compliment. Well, I mean, it's sort of like saying like this, hey, Bob, you got a really nice, good-looking suitcase. Hey, by the way, can you tell me what happened to that missing $10,000 in the retirement plan? Good hairdo. It just doesn't really work. You can kind of see through it that it's insincere. Okay, so And the other playing games is entrapment. This can look like this. So you ask, so how did things go to school today? Oh, the same old stuff. Everything went fine. Oh, fine. Well, the principal called me and told me that you started a food fight. Do you call that fine? So the entrapment mode is you know something's wrong. You invite the person to see if they'll tell you whether there's something wrong, and then you entrap them in a lie or a deception, and then you just make things worse. That's just playing games. It doesn't go far. The other, play charades. Don't play charades. In other words, don't depend on body language to communicate what it is that you're upset about. Someone shows up late at the meeting, they walk in, and you go, okay. That's not, a raised eyebrow of disapproval. It's just a real dysfunctional way of dealing with people. Or pass the buck. Pass the buck. Don't pass the buck. This can happen with parents, for example, where you blame your spouse. Your father wants you to do this, so do it. Well, that kind of implies that, well, it's up to me. You wouldn't have to do it and you'd be off the hook and everything would be fine, but you got to put up with your father. I mean, that's really, kind of blaming the boss. It's disloyal. It's dishonest. I mean, you might even agree with your spouse that this should be done, but you don't want to be the villain, and so you hide behind it. It's kind of cowardly. Also, don't play read my mind. What this is that you're forcing the person into self-discovery. So, for example, you might say, hey, Carmen, why do you think I brought you into my office today? May shrug his shoulders. Well, it's because I crashed the company car. No, guess again. Well, it's because I sabotaged the phone system. No, well, guess again. It's really kind of a cruel way, and it's the demeaning way of dealing with people. The key is to be absolutely upfront. Describe the gap. But we have to start with safety. When people don't feel safe, they're not likely to be cooperative or receptive in the conversation. And so, what causes people to feel unsafe? First, it's a lack of mutual respect. They don't feel respected as a human being. And it's also a lack of mutual purpose. They don't feel that you care about what's important to them or their goals. So the way in which to deal with establishing mutual respect is a process called contrasting. So what that means is it requires that we begin, before we engage in the conversation, is to think about, well, what are the things that are going to cause them not to be respected? So this requires some real reflection upon where that other person is coming from. So contrasting kind of works like this. I know you're trying to do your best to improve your grades. I'm satisfied with your effort. So please don't take what I'm about to say as a criticism, but I'd like to offer some strategies in better study habits. Okay, so what I've done is saying, if I come up and say, you got the grades, and then you say, well, let me tell you how to study better. Well, the immediate response is going to be, well, gee, you didn't really care about how well I thought I did pretty good. I've been trying hard. And so the person feels disrespected. So to move into a direction where you kind of acknowledge that up front, I don't want to, this is great. This is good grades. It's good improvement, but let me help you do even better. And so it acknowledges and takes away the feeling of disrespecting, because you've already told them, I don't want to disrespect you in this way. You've done it up front. That's called contrasting. You're contrasting what it is that you're trying to do and what it is that you're not trying to do from that person's perspective. The other thing is mutual purpose. The challenge here is that when somebody feels that you don't care about what they care about, typically the conversation isn't going to go well. And they're going to be fearful about what's going to happen to them. They're going to have anxiety about the future, because it's like, you don't really care about what I care about. You're just making me do what you want me to do. And so part of it is helping the person understand a common goal. What is the shared goal here that we want? And that's not always easy, especially dealing with children, because the level of maturity, they don't necessarily have any goals that the parent has. You know, having a clean house, for example, is not necessarily of value to a child until the point where they can't find their stuff. But for most adults, for most older people, it's a beginning to really think about, well, what's important to that person? What's important to me? If you're all working for the same organization, at least the bottom line is the organization should be successful, profitable, and do well, or effective in the ministry or the activities that you're trying to carry out. And you can start from that point and begin to work backwards and begin to help the person see the consequences of what it is that they're doing, and what it is their failure to do whatever it is going to impact the larger organization or the commonly held values. So part of it is sharing your path. This goes back to the ugly story bit, where we don't want to tell the ugly story, but we want to help the person understand where we're coming from. And so we start with the facts, and you describe what is it you saw and what you heard, and then you don't lead with your stories. You stay external to what's observed and explain what, but not why. And you just simply gather the facts. And so every time that you do this, you want to invite the person to be able to tell their perspective, explain it from their point of view. And so you always end with a question. It's always best to ask with a question. So I skipped one part. Ask if your perceptions are true. So I'm wondering if am I missing something here? Do I not understand something here? And so you're ending with a question that might be, what happened here? Can you tell me what went on? And so you're learning, and you're allowing them to describe. Now, you may already know, but you may not know. You may not know everything that happened. I had a situation where I went to the doctor's office, and I had some symptoms, and the nurse decided they have these things where she thinks she knows what it is, and you can click this sort of auto-populate the symptoms bit on the record. And so she thought she knew what was happening, and she auto-populated it and put all these symptoms that I didn't have. And so when I went for further testing, because it didn't resolve the issue, they were saying, well, you've had all these symptoms in the past. I said, I never had all those symptoms. I didn't have any of those symptoms. And so I wrote a letter to the doctor because I was frustrated by the fact that this nurse, from my point of view, messed up. And so then she wrote a letter describing that she had totaled her car that morning, and she had all this stressful things going on, and she was apologetic that she wasn't more careful about entering things in, but tried to just make things easier. It didn't really change my reality, but at least put me in a position to appreciate, okay, it was not a happy day for her, and she messed up. I began to appreciate her situation a little more deeply. Now, I'm going to quickly go over the last bit and then open it up for questions. The next thing under 5 is make it motivating. Consequences motivate people. And so you explore the natural consequences, and you look at answering the question why we're doing things in terms of helping people be motivated. You want to make it easy as possible for people. We have a situation where we have our children clean their bathrooms on a regular basis. And what's important is that we make sure that they have all that they need to do it. They have rubber gloves, they have the chemicals they need, they have the sponges, they have the information about what they do first, what they do second. That's important in terms of making it easier for them. And then we stay focused and flexible. Sometimes when you enter into a conversation, another problem arises in the course of the conversation. It might even be the way you're being spoken to is disrespectful. Okay, well, then that means, okay, we need to shift the conversation away from, okay, you didn't do your chores, to, okay, now you're disrespecting me. Which is more important, the chores or the disrespect? Well, there's several layers. There's the chore themselves, the expectations of having them done and the ramifications of not having them done. But then there's this more important thing that, okay, I'm not getting respected in the course of this conversation. So then you need to be flexible and say, okay, I'm going to set this thing aside and then address this issue, okay? And then make sure you go back to that issue. And not go on to other issues, not introduce like, well, you know, it's the same as over here, when, you know, you just go down a rabbit hole and you can not get anywhere depending on who it is that you're managing and the capability of them to receive everything that you're talking about. And the last thing is just move to action. So if you don't end an accountability discussion well, it will be a waste of time. If you don't end it by having some concrete plan to move forward and then ensure that the plan is agreed upon by both of you, that's one of the things we find even with our children, that it works better if we can get them to literally, physically say, yeah, I agree with this plan. And then the challenge is to follow up, make sure that it's actually been executed. And it doesn't necessarily only with children, it's with colleagues too, to say, okay, we're committed to doing this. And most people won't even speak out about a team member who's really dropped the ball that messes up the whole team. And so to be able to enter into this, just so that they know that you care in a way that's not threatening to them, can prevent this from becoming a pattern, and then also prevent the whole situation breaking down in terms of relationships. So I'll stop there. And any questions, any observations, any experience that you've had that kind of resonates with this? Okay, I guess you're all masters of your crucial accountability. Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pastor. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Excellent training. Again, I want to just remind you guys to log on to empoweringpastors.com. You can get a lot more info there about having Dr. Spencer come out to your churches or to your workplaces to give similar training as this, and as well to log in and to register for our conference that's coming up March 19th through the 21st. Have a great day.
Sure.